Welcome to From Our Generation, where we uncover the ideas and events that shape the world we live in today. I'm Crom Carmichael.
And I'm Mike Hassel.
Together we'll explore the past to better understand the present, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about how you think about it. Well, Mike, here we are for our episode 5.
5.
Yes, of From Our Generation to Yours. And Mike, we were talking about this just before we started. We are at a point in history that I'm 76 years old, and during my entire adult life, government has grown, the government has gotten bigger at the national level all throughout that entire time. Sometimes it's grown more slowly than others, but during that entire time.
Especially quickly in wartime.
Yes.
It's bigger and then doesn't go back.
Correct. Or any other type of crisis. So, for example, when we had the dot-com boom and then the bust in 2001, there was legislation passed to try to address that. And that legislation layered on a whole nother level of government involvement.
And who was it that said you never let a crisis go to waste?
That was Rahm Emanuel. Now, Rahm Emanuel might have been quoting somebody else. But,
okay.
but the point was that a crisis should always be used to increase the power of government. And so we may have actually reached a tipping point, and that the people, by putting in President Trump and looking at what President Trump has done, we're now a little more than 2 weeks. We're closing in on the third week of his administration, and the speed at which he is making changes is breathtaking, I think, is the only way to describe it.
You know, a lot of times inflection points are only very clear in retrospect. 10, 20 years after the fact, you can look back and say, that's where everything changed.
Yes.
And we have the marvelous opportunity to recognize that we probably are in the middle of a very profound tipping point.
Yes. That may last that may last for years, but that's the part that we don't know.
Yes.
But I want to try to go back, and I want to do two things to kind of set up the last part of this podcast. The first is I want to go back and talk about the Constitution at the time that it was written and ratified, and what the goals were of the people who drafted it, because they had a lot of different opinions, but they had to set those opinions aside. I mean, I'm talking about on particular issues, and they had to work together on bigger themes on what would create a durable set of rules that society could live by over a long period of time, recognizing the circumstances would change, but the Constitution had to be flexible enough, but yet strong enough to resist change that shouldn't happen, meaning revolutionary type change, so that you could have evolutionary change that still could be very, very powerful in its effect on people, and still have the underlying Constitution exist.
It's probably useful to look at dates for a moment to set a timing context here, because we tend to point to 1776 is when the nation was founded, like it happened in one day. And so the settlements in North America started in the 1600s. Yeah. People had been here for a century. There were states. States were starting to be organized around constitutions, which was a new idea, but state constitutions came first. So then you have the run-up to the Declaration of Independence, which was a couple of decades of people starting to see themselves as an independent nation rather than a colony of Britain. And John Adams said the revolution was in people's minds, not so much on the battlefield. It was first in people's minds. Some people call it a civil war because there was a balance of opinion in the country about whether to be English or not.
And it was divided approximately a third. A third of the population adamantly wanted independence. A third was more or less ambivalent, and about a third did not want to declare independence because they knew it would bring war, and so they didn't want that. Now, some of that group also had some vested interests in keeping things exactly the way they were. Other people were legitimately saying war against England cannot be won. So therefore, it should not be fought.
And this wasn't such an obvious thing to choose, right?
Right.
People, when they say we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, I think was the phrase they used
yes.
in the Declaration. That was real. They basically were having their homes destroyed.
Well, when they signed that document, if they lost the war, every one of them would have been tried for treason
and probably hanged.
Yes,
right.
Yeah, because that's what happened. That's how people who revolted in those days. That's
so
how
stakes are they're not abstract.
Yeah,
and so you have this lead up to 1776, but then it took a whole another decade before the Constitution was created in 87, I believe.
Yes,
1787. So these things are processes.
Right.
We've heard about people now like to talk about the process of this and the process of that, like everything is a process. Well, there's some truth to it because things just can't happen that quickly. And then after the Constitution, it took a while for it to be ratified in the states. And so this is really a few decades long process.
Right.
If you take all of the shoulder events into what was going on right before the Declaration and within a decade or two after.
Yeah, well, you've had the Articles of Confederation, which we've discussed before. Took 90 days to negotiate, 3.5 years to ratify, and 5 years to be determined a failure. And so now they say, okay, well, what we thought was going to last a long time didn't. So now that we recognize that and we know we have to draft something that we hope will last a long time, what are the contours of that document and what does it need to include? And what's interesting is that it's not like there was a roadmap to how to have self-government, because there wasn't. No place in the world had self-government in the way that we were that we had established it in the Articles of Confederation, which then didn't work for a variety of reasons. Because when you give people the ability, the right to do things like coin money. Like argue over trade. There were all these different things so that the colonies ended up being competitors with each other rather than partners with each other.
Where we started on the first podcast was with a graph that looked like a hockey stick that changed in the late 1700s, right? And so we're talking about now what happened then that unleashed this human potential that have made lives so profoundly better in that period. And one of the things was no longer kings telling people what they have to do. You have democracy, I think, in a broad sense, that governments are accountable to people. They're hired by the people. They're not superintendents of the people.
Right. And so when they drafted the Constitution, they said, okay, we want to empower the federal government or the national government, but then we want to restrict those powers. Now, part of what they were doing there was they were recognizing on the Articles of Confederation, when each of the colonies were given the powers to do different things, they would abuse those powers in ways that was not workable. And so they said, okay, the federal government will have the power to do certain things that the states will not have the power to do, or that the colonies will not have the power to do. One of those is to coin money. Another one was things like immigration, setting the budget for the national government. They wanted to divide that. So they said the House of Representatives, which are elected every 2 years, they are the people who will determine the budget of the country. They vote on it first. Then it has to be approved by the Senate, and then the president can either sign it into law or veto it, and then there's another process. So there was checks, what we refer to as checks and balances throughout. And then they said, okay, well, we need to have an independent judiciary because they knew that there would be times when the executive branch or when the president and the Congress would disagree, and when the states would disagree with the federal government, and they needed to have a place to adjudicate those differences without gunfire, without leading to violence. And so they set up an independent system of courts that's what is known as, it's called the third branch of government. So you had the judiciary, you had the legislative branch, and you had the executive branch. And each one was given powers that applied to their branch, and how they controlled, how each branch controlled its own power.
And correct me if I'm wrong, lawyers talk about Article 1 powers, Article 2 powers, and Article 3. Article 1 is the legislature because it's primary,
okay,
because it's a representative government accountable to the people. Article 2 is the executive, and then Article 3, I believe. I'm not a lawyer, so I could be wrong, but I think there's like 5 articles in the Constitution.
Yeah, I'm not clear on that.
There's a level of detail beyond our expertise, but I think the point is these are very clearly organized in the Constitution, and if you talk to lawyers about it, they will refer to powers by the article they come from.
Mm-hmm. and then you have but then they also said, but the federal government will have will have certain powers, and all powers that are not given specifically to the federal government are left to the states. And so they recognized that the people in our country, which they also knew that country geographically was going to grow from the size that it was, and they knew that it would become more complex over time, and they knew that the differences may become greater or less. But they wanted the states to be able to set the terms of their own set of laws for the citizens within their states to be determined by the citizens from each of the states.
Of that state.
Yeah. But one thing they said was the states can't coin money.
Right.
And so what's interesting is that, and I'm going to use Tennessee as an example because we live here, and I'm also very familiar with kind of the last 40 to 45 year history of Tennessee. And that is that you had in the 80s, actually for over 100 years, the Democrat Party controlled the legislature of Tennessee. And for the most part, it controlled the executive branch. Now, starting in the 70s, you started to see Republicans get elected to the governor's office, but you still had Democrats in charge of the state house and the state senate
in Tennessee.
Yes, yeah. In Tennessee. But our state constitution had language in there that prohibited a state income tax, and so and it also said that the legislature or that the state must balance its budget. And so that was a constraint and there were many Democrats who were perfectly happy with that constraint. But there were other Democrats who wanted to spend more money. And since they were the party in power, the people who wanted to spend more money and add more programs, they were frustrated because they knew the main source of revenue for the state was the sales tax. Well, the sales tax paid by everybody. And so and they would raise it 1/4 point. And they would do that about maybe every 2 or 3 years, 4 years. And it got from like 8% all the way up to like 9.5 to 9 3/4. And they didn't want it to go to 10. And so for a 15-year period, there was a great effort on the part of those who wanted the government to become bigger. They wanted to be able to impose an income tax, but they didn't want to go through the process of amending the state constitution because politically that would hurt them. Yeah. And so for 15 years, there were arguments that were made and printed in the press and on TV and everything. Only talk radio was the only journalistic channel, so to speak, that opposed the state income tax on constitutional grounds. But you had lawyers who would draft language. You had prior judges who would draft language, and they would articles and columns, and they would say, well, the Constitution does not say that you can't have a state income tax. And so that all came to a head in 1999. There was an attempt in the state house to pass a state income tax because you had a Republican governor who was willing to and endorsed a state income tax, having run twice, claiming that an income tax would pass in this state over his dead body, and so it came to a vote, and there were 5 Democrats in the state house who didn't want a state income tax, but knew that the political pressure would be so great if they came out and said they were against it, that they were very clever the way that they did it. And they told the speaker that they would vote for a state income tax as long as their individual vote was the one that put it over the top. And so he thought he had 5 yeses. And so when they called the vote, they dispersed in the chamber to the 4 corners of the chamber, and one stood in the center. The speaker held that vote open for 3 hours, and he's running around trying to get those 5 people to come together, and they wouldn't. They wouldn't leave where they were. And after 3 hours, the speaker realized that he had been had, and we didn't have a state. I mean, this is amazing stuff. Yeah. But this is how human beings act, because we are human, and people who are very passionate about something, whether they're right or wrong, they think they're right, and so it didn't pass.
Yeah, we have a saying about my wife: she is maybe right, and she may be wrong, but she's never in doubt.
There you go. Well, yeah, and I'm not going to go there.
Oh, she'll say the same thing.
Okay, all
yeah,
right.
It's a joke
Oh,
in our
okay.
family.
But well, it's interesting because then after you had all these Democrats who pressed the yes button on the state income tax, thinking it was going to pass the House, they were now on record. But they had spent the last 2 or 3 campaigns saying they were against the state income. Now they're on the record. And so over the next 3 or 4 election cycles, the state House and the state Senate turned from being Democrat to Republican. And then since then, we have eliminated the estate tax. We have eliminated
the estate tax.
The estate.
The tax on your
a
when
death
you
tax.
die. Yes, death tax, yeah.
More or less the death tax, which was high. We eliminated that. We've eliminated a tax that was called the Hall tax, which I guess was named after a legislator named Hall, but it was a 6% tax on interest and dividends. And so by eliminating those 2 taxes, we don't have a capital gains tax. We don't have an income tax. By doing that, we have made Tennessee a very attractive place for people to move who want to grow businesses. And as a result, our sales tax revenue has consistently risen above the level that was predicted. And so we are able, as a result, we've been running surpluses at the state level. And our state is very, very well governed by virtually anybody who believes that limited government and personal freedom and income growth at the individual level is the goal of a state government's policies.
There's an interesting and critical point embedded here, which is that there is not a direct correlation between tax rates and tax revenue.
That's absolutely true.
Okay, we tend to think you raise the rate, you get more revenue. And this is called the Laffer curve for those who know about Art Laffer, who now moved to Tennessee.
Yes, from California.
Yeah, he got fed up with California, and he's our neighbor now.
Yes.
But his famous Laffer curve, which dates from the Reagan era, is that you have a bell-shaped graph, and the higher you go on tax rates, once you get over the middle optimization point, the less revenue you get because you repress economic activity.
Right. And so in Tennessee, we're at one very extreme end of that bell curve, in that our taxes on individual work and growth is 0. Our tax is a consumption tax. Now, at the local level, we have property taxes. And so the state lives primarily on the sales tax. Local government lives primarily on the property tax. So that's how Tennessee works. But the main point of this is I wanted to talk about was the constraints that
on the growth of government.
On the growth of government, and it was written into our Constitution that you have to balance the budget.
Right.
Now, that constraint doesn't apply at the federal level.
Right.
And so consequently, if people want to spend more money at the federal level, they have 2 ways of doing it. One is they can increase taxes, which upsets the people who've just had their taxes increased, or the other is they can just borrow the money and increase the debt. Well, there's a point at which the borrowing the money and increasing the debt becomes harmful to the point where doing more of it hurts so many people that politically that becomes problematic. And I think that that's what we're talking about: is have we reached that inflection point at this time? I think we have, but time will tell. And
I think it's interesting to say that there comes a point where you can't raise taxes high enough to pay off that amount of debt.
Yes. Well,
it would suffocate an economy to raise rates to 60, 70, 80%. They just are not workable.
Well,
and so you end up printing money.
Correct.
Equivalent to what we call printing money. Now we don't have paper money so much as we have money as in accounts. But they borrow money, and so it has to end up as inflation. It's either going to be in tax or inflation, which basically takes money out of everybody's pocket.
It lowers the standard. What it does, there are 2 ways of lowering the standard of living. Right. One is to raise taxes, and the other is through inflation.
Inflate the currency.
Yeah, inflate the currency. And so we're now at a point. But I still want to stick with this question about is our Constitution functioning under the current environment? Because I've heard commentators say that this is now a battle between the executive branch and the Congress. And Mike, I want to make a comment and see if you think it more accurately reflects what's actually going on. This is actually, I believe, a battle between the president of the executive branch and the unions that of the employees of the executive branch.
Who's in charge within the executive branch?
Yes. And so the question is, does the president, under our Constitution, have the authority to manage the executive branch?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, the Article 1 is about the legislature. It's the primary body.
Mm-hmm.
But what we have is legislatures that have for decades passed ambiguous laws because they didn't want to take a strong stance, and then they leave it to the executive branch to work out the details.
Mm-hmm.
And so the executive branch has grown and grown and grown in terms of staffing. And you have people there that think it's their responsibility to enact what they think the Congress wanted.
Right.
And that tends to be pro-government people because they think they're doing good things.
Mm-hmm.
And so now it is about a fight over political accountability within the executive branch, right?
Yes.
And you have people that think, well, you have civil service reforms, shortly after the Civil War because there was so much abuse with people bringing in their political hacks that would just do things that were not well disciplined. And so the idea of civil service came about where you just don't fire somebody on a whim, right? So that's over 100 years old. But now we're at a century later and seeing the downside of lack of accountability, where people enact their own policy no matter what the president thinks. And I've seen in the last few weeks very interesting commentary from senior people in the various parts of the executive branch that say, it's not my opinion that matters. We're enacting the president's policies.
Right, right. And that's when you get to Barack Obama famously said, elections have consequences.
Right.
And that's actually, it's a short statement, but it's a very profound statement under our system of government, because the people who are elected do have the power under our system of government to pass the laws that we live by and then to execute them. But they still have to do it. They still have to do it under the Constitution. And so what you've had in the past, my lifetime, is the Congress would pass laws and then they would give it, as you say, to the executive branch, but they'd give it to agencies within the executive branch and tell them to execute the laws. Well, the agencies in the executive branch still are supposed to, or a lot of people believe, they still report to the president.
This is the constitutional fight to come, because a number of those things like the Consumer Financial Protection, is it Bureau, PFB?
CF, yeah.
It was explicitly set up to not be accountable to the president,
right?
Not be fireable by the president, et cetera, all these things. And then the courts come along and say, no, you can't do that.
No, the courts didn't in this case.
Well,
the CFPB, the Supreme Court, and it's, we could argue over whether or not they should have or not, but they said that the way that the Congress passed that
was constitutional.
They passed that 5-4. Now, but they also, within that, they said some things that the president still does have certain powers. And so Trump is now exercising those powers when it comes to the consumer, because he fired the person who was in charge, which he had the right to do. And then he made the Treasury Secretary the interim head of it, and he may never change that.
Right.
And
that'll certainly be adjudicated again. But this is really what the fight is about, is the point we're trying to get to, is the way the Constitution set up these authorities. You have the Congress often wanting to run the executive branch and tell them what to do, investigate them, and give them orders. That's constitutionally suspect, shall we say.
Right. They have oversight, yes, but they can't tell them what to do. And this is what's going to be the topic of today. When I say today, I don't mean for our show, but right now, in the last few days, a department of the federal government that, frankly, I didn't even know about. It's called USAID. It turns out it's a $40 billion program that gives money all over the world for various reasons. And now we're getting to the detail, literally the line item of grants.
Names of the grants that they made.
And some of them are just absolutely mind-bogglingly absurd. Yeah. And this is what Elon Musk is doing. What I find fascinating about some of the people who oppose Elon Musk is they claim that Elon Musk is unelected, and therefore he has no authority. And I'm saying, well, who elected the bureaucrats who claim that they do have authority? And the answer is nobody elected them.
Right.
So they are equally, so if Elon Musk has no authority, then no bureaucrat in Washington has authority. So since neither of those things is true, now the question is, who has the ultimate authority over a particular employee in the national government? Now, here's something else that's interesting. Every single federal employee, except the president, takes the same oath of office before they get their first paycheck. And that is that they will uphold the Constitution. And this has some other things. The presidential oath is a little different. But every federal employee, well, so now the question is, if they've taken that oath and they're in the executive branch, do they answer to the president ultimately as in terms of their employment? Now, if you're a congressional staffer, President of the United States can't say anything about what, unless you're breaking some law, then you can be investigated. But how you do your job is not something the executive branch can determine. If you're in the judiciary, neither the Congress nor the president can tell members of the judiciary how to conduct their jobs, as long as they're doing it within the law. And so it's just fascinating to me to look at how we have this document that was drafted to be able to manage substantial differences of opinion and do it without people shooting each other. Because historically, up until our Constitution, that's how issues were ultimately resolved when the pressure got so great. The French Revolution, it also had a 30 or 40 year period where the king and the people associated with the king, they were continuing to gain more and more power at the expense of the average Frenchman, and eventually that became so untenable that there was a revolution. But in that revolution, which lasted about 15 years, and thousands and thousands of people were executed. By the way, just as an aside, they were executed with a guillotine. The guillotine was invented by a doctor named Guillotine.
Yeah, French word, last name.
Right, and he invented it so that the state could execute people less violently.
Yeah, more humanely.
More humanely, because they used to draw them and quarter them.
Well, that was a punishment, that you tie people's legs and arms to horses that go in 4 different directions and pull them apart.
Yes.
And this was humiliation, extremely painful, but also just a regular execution. They used axes.
Yes.
And people used to bribe the executioner to sharpen the axe so it would take one blow and not 2 or 3.
Right.
I mean, these were horrible scenes that would take place. So the guillotine, I guess, in theory, was an improvement that would get this over fast.
Yeah, and have it be quick. Well, then when the French Revolution happened, they mass-produced guillotines, and they used them to take them out, and they would try people in the morning and execute them around 1 o'clock. And so thousands and thousands of people were killed. Their economy shrunk, and the economy was not that strong to begin with. It shrunk 60%. And it ultimately didn't end until Napoleon Bonaparte came along, and he came along also at a time where all the leaders of the revolution had also been killed, been guillotined because the mob turned on them also because their promises were unfulfilled.
Well, our theme here is the growth of government and stability of government.
Yes.
And you look at France, and they've had now, 5 or 6 republics? I'm not really that versed on French history, but I know it's at least 5.
Yes.
And they were unsuccessful at finding a regime that would stick more than a decade or two.
Right.
Until later in the 18th century, and then there was World War I and World War II and all kinds of instability. So the point is, we have something pretty precious in the United States as a government that has lasted between 200 and 300 years. We're now up to 200 and
closing in on 250.
250 next year, I think it is, and that's remarkable.
Yes, I guess 2 years, 2027, because it was 87
from the Constitution.
From the Constitution,
but from the Declaration of Independence is 1776, and that would be 250 from 1776.
Okay, well, yes, but our Constitution. It did 2 things. It empowered the national government, and it limited the powers. And we became a constitutional republic, not a democracy.
Yes.
And that was very important, too, in terms of the dispersion of power. And Franklin Roosevelt famously said to a lady, what is the quote that he said to the lady who asked him, Dr. Franklin, what have you given us?
Oh, Ben Franklin.
Ben Franklin?
Yeah, he said, a republic if you can keep it.
Yeah, yeah. And
I think his point was once people learn that they can vote themselves money from the Treasury, then the system will be corrupted. And that's part of what we're struggling with now.
Yeah, and so what's interesting now, if we take the Constitution was drafted to be able to handle things like this. So, for example, I'll give another recent example. Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court, and there was great consternation. Many people were very, very upset. And what that did was it simply took the question of abortion and put it back at the state level. Well, that overturning Roe v. Wade happened, 3 or 4 years ago? So we've now gone through.
It's called the Dodd decision.
The Dodd decision. So I believe we've gone through 2 election cycles. And so at the state level, each state has had to wrestle with this very difficult issue. But each state has now come up with how the law will apply to that issue within that state. And now that issue, as a political issue, is still a very important issue within the states, but it's now lost its national appeal as an issue because it is now being resolved the way that our Constitution said that issues like that should be resolved, and that is, one state may think this, one other state may think that. So each state will determine that.
To me, a really important aspect of this is there's not a single right answer to questions like that.
Yeah.
There are many answers that have their pros and cons, and people choose. That's what parliaments are for. Parley means talk. Okay, so these are places of talk, houses to talk, parliament, and that's how we settle our differences, by talking them through till we find solutions we can all live with.
Right.
But the idea that issues should be universalized to Washington with one result on all of these things that are so complex and do not lend themselves to a single simple answer. I think the Constitution is the solution for making us live together.
Well, and to your point, our Constitution disperses the power not just among the 3 branches, but disperses the power
among the states.
And that's really something, because you talked about Parliament that's where we talk. I think in Great Britain, when Parliament passes a law, it applies to all of Great Britain. They don't
have states the way we have it.
Yes.
But each state has its own legislature, its own parliament, so to speak. And so it's very complex. You have city level, then state level, then national level, and they kind of bump up against each other, right? We've worked out kind of. But still, you then have these major changes like Dodd, where we shift from a national level to a state level. Mm-hmm. And that responsiveness, that capability to adapt and change is incredibly important.
Yeah. And so now let's if we could, let's go ahead and back up a little bit to what I think was kind of an inflection point in our country that went from being where the federal government was limited in terms of scope and power to where it began the long, almost 100-year growth, and that would be the election of FDR. And
before we get to the 1930s, I think it's worth saying that the federal government basically lived off tariff revenue. If you go to New York, down near the stock exchange, there's the customs house, and that was the major place for revenue in the federal government at that time, because so much of U.S. commerce came through New York. And there was no income tax. There was no sales tax. There was no property tax.
Yeah. Now, that was now in 1913. I'm
talking about the 1800s when this happened. It started to change in the progressive area, early 1900s, and then you're going to talk about FDR in the 1930s.
Right.
But the point is, the country, we said now we're about almost 250 years old. For at least 100 to 150 of that, the federal government had no source of revenue except tariffs.
Right. And so in 1913, the Constitution was amended to allow an income tax. Now, at the time that happened, the people who were the proponents of an income tax said the top tax rate would be 7%, and it would only apply on people making more than $1 million, which back then $1 million was a huge amount of money.
Right.
And so it'd be very limited. That was in 1913. Then we got into the First World War. The top marginal tax rate went from 7% to 77% in a period of 6 years. So the people who supported, this is what people need to recognize, that once the door is open, you never know who is going to walk through it.
Well, back to Tennessee, this was the point of view of the people that resisted it. Once you put it in, even if it's small and doesn't seem that burdensome, it's going to get burdensome because you know the habits of people that want more money.
Right. And so then it went up to 77%, and the justification for that was, well, we were fighting the First World War. Okay, well, you can make that argument that there's justification. But then to your point, when the war ended,
it didn't go back.
It didn't go back to 7%. It did drop, though, to a top marginal tax rate of 25%. And that's where the tax rate was in 1929, in 1930, in that period when the economy collapsed for a variety of reasons. One was we imposed enormous increase in tariffs in 1929. And then
that was called the Smoot-Hawley Act, if I recall.
Yes. And by the way, both Smoot and Harley were senators.
Yes.
Both of them lost their very next election, which was either in 1930 or 1932. But they lost their next election. Roosevelt then gets elected in 1932. But what we'll be doing in future podcasts is we're going to be using a speech that was given by Al Smith in 1936. Now, Al Smith had been the governor of New York for 8 years. He was a lifelong Democrat, and as you can tell from the quotes in his speech, he was a very, very proud Democrat. But he also, what you would say is a conservative Democrat in the sense of he didn't believe in bigger and bigger government. And so what he does in 1936, at the beginning of that year, he then takes quotes from the Democrat platform of 1932 that Roosevelt ran on. And then it shows that Roosevelt, once elected, did exactly the opposite of what he said he would do. And so what we're going to be talking about is that Roosevelt, when he got elected in 1932, and we're talking about now, this is the beginning of this very long period, which may still be going on, but we may be at that inflection point that we talked about. But in 1932, he gets elected, and so in 1933, when he took office, which was in March, by the way, back then you got elected in November, you didn't get inaugurated until March. He takes office, and he passes the National Recovery Act, and then he passes another act called the Agricultural Adjustment. Agricultural Adjustment Administration. And those two bills passed Congress. The National Recovery Act essentially gave the executive branch power over the entire economy. It could set prices. It could tell you that your prices are too high. It could tell you your prices are too low. It could tell you what wages you had to pay. I mean, it was the term fascism is associated almost at the hip with Nazism. But fascism is a form of government where the power of government to control economic decisions rests in the central government. It's close to communism in the sense of its power. But Roosevelt absolutely had tremendous authority over the economy. He also dramatically raised taxes. It was 25% when he came into office, and then it rose. It ultimately got as high as 94% in 1944, right at the end of the war. But I believe we have a chart that we can pull up, and we can show what is important is not on this chart. What is important is not how high the top marginal tax rate is. It was how quickly you reached the 50% tax bracket. And as you can see from the chart that we have up here, you reached 50% at lower and lower and lower numbers. And the point is if government
So
is
now, what do you mean? You read 50% tax rate at lower and lower incomes.
yes, at lower and lower income levels. And so you see that all through the 30s. You see that 50% tax rate. Well, now it applies instead of at $50,000, it applies at 40. Then it might apply at 25, and it kept getting lower and lower and lower.
Yeah.
And so essentially that means that your government is your partner. It gets half of whatever you make.
Well, the pretense in this is that you're going to tax the rich, the people that can most afford it.
Yeah.
But there's not enough money there.
Right.
And so they end up having to expand the definition of the rich downwards and incorporate more and more of the middle class to produce any real money.
Right. Now, the other thing that was very interesting, what Roosevelt did was he forced everybody who owned gold to sell it to the federal government for $20 and some pennies. So it was a little over $20. And then he turned around a couple of years later, and now he said gold is now worth $35. So he essentially made you. It'd be like the government forcing you to sell your $500,000 house to the government for $250,000, and then the government turns around and sells it to somebody else for $500,000,
right?
And leaves you without the money that was yours. And so these are some of the things that Roosevelt did. Now, what's interesting is that Roosevelt, by many people, is described as the president who saved us from the Depression, who got us out of the Depression. And actually, nothing could be further from the truth. And so what we're going to show you in these graphs is what the economic growth was. We're also going to be the economic growth and the unemployment rate in particular. The unemployment rate got back to close to 20% in 1938. Now, he takes office in 33. He makes all these promises of what he was going to accomplish economically and help the country. And by the way, if you were, and it's a little bit like today in this sense, that if you were a business person who disagreed with Roosevelt, he would use the full force of government to come after you. In 1935, he got a law passed through Congress that took over the utility industry. I didn't know this until I started looking at this period, but utilities, this is to provide lights and electricity to homes, which, by the way, that was a brand new thing just a couple of decades.
Rural electricity.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, even in cities, electricity was invented and it didn't get deployed until sometime in the early 1900s. And it was done by private companies. And so private companies, and they would raise capital, they would put in electricity, and then people would pay their electric bill, and then they would do more and more and more of that. Well, Roosevelt saw that. He wanted to take over the whole industry. And so in 1935, he passed a law that gave the federal government the authority over utilities. And so he then used that power. And so the period of the 30s, and what I'm saying is the period of the 30s was where the federal government became much bigger, much more powerful, but the Constitution still stood. The Constitution still worked as an underpinning, even though there are a lot of people who disagreed with Roosevelt. The only way that they could express their disagreement was at the voting booth. Now, you could still stand up. You had the certain rights to freedom of speech, although Roosevelt used the power of the federal government to issue licenses, for example, for radio stations, and then later TV stations, and he would issue those licenses for 1 year. And so if he believed that you were not living by your license, he took away some of those licenses, and it was amazing how responsive the various medias became to supporting his policies so they could keep their licenses.
So there was this vast expansion of government from the New Deal.
Yes.
And we're going to look forward to what's going on now and how this may be reversing some of what happened in the New Deal. I think it's worth observing that there have been three major periods of change to the Constitution in the country's history. One was immediately after the founding. The first 10, the Bill of Rights were the first 10 amendments, right? And then you had a period after the Civil War to come to terms with the changes in the country in the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And then you had the Progressive Era in the early 1900s, a spate of other constitutional amendments.
Yes.
But we haven't had very many since then, and none in about 50 years or so.
Right.
And so we're reaching a point where a lot of things have grown out of proportion. Nobody has talked about changing the Constitution yet. It's bound to come up. There are some prohibitions and limits in the Constitution that some people want to break. So those will be controversies that are coming. But I think it's worth saying that the Constitution has gotten us through tumult after tumult after tumult.
Yeah.
We tend to think that we live in uniquely challenging times. And, I wrote this book about deep trade-offs, about balance between—
What's the title of that book?
Deep Trade-Offs, Restoring Balance and Respect in a Polarized and Angry World.
Okay.
And it came from our work in Giants of Political Thought and others, where we saw these offsetting ideas competing and continually, and neither one of them is right. This is the point, that you don't have one solution that's found in Washington and imposed on everybody. You have multiple solutions that are balanced in so many different ways. And so, I was talking to a reader of my book who said, and about polarization particularly, and he said, this started with Trump, didn't it? And I said, actually, no, in our country it started before the revolution. And in humanity, it started, way in prehistory.
Yeah.
This is the nature of human beings.
And that's
to disagree.
And that's when you're trying to draft a document that human beings are going to have to live by, you have to take human nature into account, or you won't be successful. And to your point on the giants of political thought, Mike, let's talk a little bit about two schools of thought that were being advanced around the 1700s. One was best expressed by Thomas Hobbes in a book called Leviathan.
Yes.
And the counter to that would have been John Locke in two treatises of government. Now, there were others.
Both English guys in the 16 and 1700s,
right,
before this inflection point that we started with in the late 1700s, before the United States became its own country. They were fighting civil wars in England over the rights of kings and the rights of the people.
Yes.
From Magna Carta on, just hundreds of years, centuries in the making to produce those civil wars. And Locke was on one side articulating the rights of individuals, constitutional government, limits on kings, things like that. Hobbes was saying that life in a natural state is nasty. Your people are poor. It's nasty, poor, brutish, and short, yes, I think was his description, four adjectives. And anyway, that is a crisis to be averted, and that it requires a strong government to do it. That's
right. And at the time that Hobbes was a very, very important, influential statesman. And so what he said was, in the absence of government, there's the state of nature. And in just a state of nature, it's all against all. And so there would be constant violence. People would just be killing each other. That's what it would be. John Locke, on the other hand, he said, no, that's not how it would be. People would learn to cooperate because it would be in their self-interest to cooperate, and they would do better. Now, at the time that both of these people were writing, there'd never been what you and I, or what we think of in this country as either a democracy or a constitutional republic. You had people who inherited their position of king, and then you also had relationships in some countries between the church and the state, which generally were locked at the hip to increase the power of the state and the church.
Well, the church was the state in a lot of these places.
Yes, yeah. And then Martin Luther comes along and he pounds his document against the door, and that then began the religious Reformation. And so it's interesting to see that you have John Locke who said that and he based his notions or his arguments on this fundamental principle, and it's incorporated in the Declaration of Independence, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. And Locke said the right to life, liberty, and property.
Right.
Meaning that if you earned it, you owned it. It was yours. You had a God-given right to that. And his argument was that no institutions created by man, i.e. the king, can justly take away your inalienable rights.
And think about how closely this related is to the prohibition of slavery.
Yes.
I cannot enslave you and take the product of your labor from you.
Yes.
There's very few people in the world that would disagree with that, particularly the Western world. I made this claim one time about nobody believes that, and a friend of mine said, yeah, I know some people in in the Middle East who believe that. So I'm cautious about broad claims, but the point being that taking someone else's labor away is clearly bad, right? In our culture, we understand that it's bad, but taking their property away is not seen as bad.
And they're the same because
It's the same.
labor produces property.
Yes.
And so at any rate,
Somebody's labor somewhere along the way. You may have inherited property, but it was your parents that may have produced it, right?
Right.
And what gives somebody else the right to take that away instead of them giving it who they want it to go to?
Right.
That's the logic.
Yeah, and life in the times that we've talked about before, in those 1600s and 1700s, there was constant war. You had the 30 Years' War, where you had a few 100,000 soldiers died and millions of civilians died because they starved to death because the soldiers would steal their food and their livestock. And so the world was a very difficult place and a very dangerous place to live. So now we fast forward to Roosevelt and the Depression. The stock market had collapsed, the economy had collapsed, unemployment surged past 20%. There wasn't really a safety net, and so times were very, very difficult. And Roosevelt steps in, making promises to do a certain thing, and then he did the opposite of those things. Now, whatever you want to argue about that is not really the point. It's the point that it's not that he broke his word. To me, that is the main issue. It's that the things that he didn't work, but yet history. Many historians try to claim that Roosevelt got us out of the Depression. Now, one of the reasons for claiming that Roosevelt got us out of the Depression is then you can make the argument that big government is good. Because Roosevelt,
people start with that attitude,
yeah,
and then find theories that justify it.
Right. And so in future episodes, we're going to be digging more and more into that period because that was the beginning of the period where government became bigger and bigger and bigger for various reasons. And so we're going to be tracking that. But now let's jump forward right now to where we are literally at this moment, where you have Trump has just been now in office for less than 3 weeks.
Let me just
Please
insert one thing.
Yeah.
Let's talk about COVID. This is the latest episode where a lot of norms were broken and new practices were established where people don't want to go back. You know, working at home and things like that. So a lot of that's being pulled back. There was a huge inflation that came because of all the spending that happened. And the point being that these ratchets happen in crises. Mm-hmm. This is the most recent one we've experienced.
Right.
I think a historian would say a pandemic is a big deal, a worldwide illness like that. But the economic effects of that were probably not nearly as big as the things we're talking about in the 30s and after the Civil War. Our Constitution has gotten us through much bigger shocks than even COVID. COVID's the one we're most familiar with. And so now here, 5 years after COVID, we sit at the beginning of 2025 with a new administration in the United States that's making profound changes in our constitutional order, in our way of applying the Constitution.
Right, and who's
in charge?
Yeah, who's in charge? And part of that, you mentioned COVID, and that did create tremendous instability within the institutions and who had the authority, what powers they could do. You had the federal government that said that if you don't take your COVID vaccine, you're going to lose your job, and they applied that in the federal government. You had people running around claiming that you had to wear a mask. You had various arguments.
You don't have to pay your rent.
Don't have to pay your rent. So all kinds of things were changed in the name of the
emergency.
Thank you. That's exactly the right word. Well, then now we're past that. But the size of the federal government has historically, and when I say historically, over the last 20 or 30 years, until just the last few years, federal spending has been about 20% of the GNP. Revenues have been between 17 and 18% of the GNP.
And GNP is the gross national product,
right,
for any of our listeners that don't know these economic terms.
Right.
Okay.
Yep. And so about 1/5 is what the federal government spent. And then 18% is what they took in revenue. So there was this 2% deficit. And so the deficit would grow a few $100 billion a year. Then it grew $1 trillion a year. And then more recently, it's now been growing at $3 trillion a year. And so that's reached a point where now interest rates, which for a 15-year period, interest rates were near zero. The federal funds rate would be literally a fraction of 8%. Now they're higher. Now it's up to 3 or 4%. You have the 10-year Treasury I think it's around 6 to 7%. Mortgage rates are up, and it may be that maybe the Treasury's at 5.5 or 6. But the point is, it's much, much higher than it used to be. And so we're now having the interest we're paying on our debt in dollars is up significantly. So we're now at a point where we cannot continue the status quo. Now, and so
you can't continue borrowing at that rate.
Yes, and so the public has now said we want to change. That's what this last election was, and even though the national election was fairly close, what's interesting is that Trump actually increased his share of the vote in all 50 states. He lost a lot of states
compared to the election that he lost to Biden.
Yes, yeah. Compared to 2020, he had a higher percentage of the vote in all 50 states, and so that's why he is claiming that he has a mandate. But whether he and what's interesting is the media is having a very hard time claiming he doesn't have a mandate because of statements that they've made in the past. And then the other thing that's happened that I think has happened in the last 24 to 36 months is that our media is now no longer controlled by a relatively small group of people. With influencers and podcasters, like we hope ourselves, we're now providing, or podcasters are providing information to voters that they weren't getting before, and so with this disbursement of information under freedom of speech, because government can't control that. What you're now seeing is that the claims by folks who have claimed that bigger and bigger government is good, and they've had a voice that has really been a megaphone. Now they're having to compete. Those ideas are having to compete. And so
two things I'd like to say. One, you said government can't control that, and I would note government has tried to control that.
Yes.
In the last 4 years, that's been part of what has been so upsetting to so many people is we're told what you're able to say, what you're able to think, and that's not constitutional.
Right.
It's very clear in our Constitution that you can't limit speech. But there have been people who thought they could do it and had great forceful, not great maybe, but forceful descriptions of why they should be able to do that.
Yeah, and they tried, and they didn't succeed.
Yeah.
They had, I think that there was some lady that was actually picked by Biden to be head of the Department of
Misinformation
and disinformation.
They were going to decide what was you could say and you couldn't. What's disinformation?
Right.
The other thing, you've said an interesting thing in tracing this 20% and 18% of GDP, and the target for inflation at the Fed is 2%. And I'm wondering if there's some kind of empirical relationship between that stable history and a 2% inflation rate, where they basically just spread out the pain in the price level of 2% a year. But it's changed now. That's up to around 25. I think the government is spending more like 25.
Yes.
And so we've had this huge inflation, back to our point that it either comes out in taxes or inflation. And we continue to borrow money at a rate that we just can't. We got to stop somewhere because people will stop loaning the money because they won't get it back. And so we're seeing employees fired in the government. Where is the spending going to stop?
Right.
There's a huge defense piece. Some people want to take it out of that, particularly on the left, because they want to keep social programs in place and a big bureaucracy that they have tremendous influence over. But the point is, we're having a huge fight and going to continue to have a huge fight over where this spending is going to be cut, so we get back to a place where we actually pay our bills.
Right. And Mike, to your point about inflation and this 2% and the 2% inflation, the Fed target and all of this, The Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He essentially said that if the deficit in spending is equal to productivity gains, that inflation would be virtually flat. And I think that logically speaking, that makes sense.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Now, but if you have a dramatic increase in spending, not an increase in the deficit, so I want to be clear about this. There's a little distinction here.
Right.
I believe that a dramatic increase in the spending of federal government is what leads to inflation, not necessarily an increase in the deficit. So what you might see here in the short term is you might see a drop in spending, and you also might see, because I heard yesterday that Trump's proposal of no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, no taxes on Social Security is going to be part of the budget that he's putting in right now. He wants this to be passed, and an extension of his tax cuts from 2017. So you might see a reduction in revenue for a short period of time. So the deficit itself might go up a little bit, but if spending is going down, but not as fast as tax revenue is going down, I'm going to make the argument that will not be inflationary. So it's not deficits per se. And so we're going to be looking at, and we'll be talking about, but we're in part of what I hope we're accomplishing in this podcast is taking some of the arguments all the way back to 1700.
Yes.
And showing how ideas have influenced the course of history, because ideas always precede the changes. It's not the other way around. And
these people were struggling with problems that look a lot like ours.
Yes. Yeah.
Many times a lot worse.
Yes.
The great consolation I've heard of being a historian is, that things have been worse.
Yes.
Almost always. No, we are very privileged to live when we do in so many ways, and we can go through that maybe in a podcast. I've had health events that were handled with an overnight stay in the hospital that would have hospitalized people months. Only 10 or 20 years ago. So we live in a glorious age in so many ways.
Yes.
We think that we're burdened uniquely,
and that's what we're going to be. And so as we observe what's going on, part of what you and I are trying to do is take observations of what's going on and place it in a historical context, so that people can see that history can be a great teacher. Because in our very first podcast, we said there are 3 ways to learn. You learn from personal experience, you learn from observations of things going on while you're alive, and you can learn from history. There's a lot more history than there is anything else.
Yes, and it's a lot cheaper to learn from 2 and 3 than it is from 1.
Yes, it sure is. Well, listen, Mike, we're gonna stop today. We're right, so let's kind of put a pin in. Here we are at the closing in of the third week of Trump, and there'll be lots, obviously, to talk about every single day. Things are changing.
That's right.
Yeah.